Welcome back. So, obviously, if you watch my introduction video, you know that this video is going to be focused mainly around Dante's Inferno and just kind of not necessarily the gameplay aspects of it, but just kind of the gender representation, the similar structure patterns that it holds to some religious structures, and just kind of, I don't know, we're just gonna kind of see where it all takes us. So as you can see, I've kind of started out the game not necessarily at the beginning. There is like about a 3 minute clip at the very beginning just explaining more about the Crusades and what specifically is happening like in Dante's world, because basically like this this game opens up during the crusading period in Europe. And if you don't know what that is, or what the Crusades were, they're basically a bunch of campaigns that were funded by basically the Catholic Church to go into countries that they deemed to be unholy and to convert the masses. Oftentimes, they really only did this through violent means, and it often turned into war because obviously foreign governments weren't too happy with the fact that foreigners were coming into their lands and basically just mass converting all these people. Many died. It in general was like a bloodbath. And there wasn't just one crusade. There was many crusades over like a very long period of time happening in the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, just kind of like all across Europe and the Middle East area. But yeah, honestly, like there is so much to cover when it comes to the Crusades that like I can't really afford to go into it too much during this particular project. I've taken about 2 classes on the Crusades, and they weren't even enough to scratch really the surface of all of the problems, economic, politically, religiously, just like everything. So I'm not even going to attempt to do that here because I know I'm not going to do it any justice. But basically, Dante's Inferno is basically set up during the crusading period. However, it does follow Dante's Divine Comedy, which is basically Dante just basically wrote about like the 7 layers of hell and described what was in each layer, and Dante's Inferno basically follows that. So it's like a bit of a mixture between medieval Catholicism and meets medieval poetry, basically, or not medieval. I'm not really sure when Dante wrote his poem, but anyway, older poetry. But getting back on topic, Dante's Inferno is a prime example of religion in video games, and thus is an example of real life religion impacting the creation of a game and impacting how people play online, which basically just means that Dante's Inferno is being impacted by obviously this very real event that happened during the Crusades, but is also obviously impacting how, like, basically bringing this real life thing into an online space where we are then interacting with it today in a more modern version. Basically just meaning that religion is affecting the game, and the game is affecting how we see religion, and it's all just kind of tangling up. But anyway, where we're starting off right now in the game is basically we're about to go in and fight the Grim Reaper. I tried many times to beat the Grim Reaper, and I did not do too well of a job until this one, so I'm really happy that I was able to get a continuous shot of me just playing through, because it did take me many times starting over and over and over again in order to properly get to this point, because although I'm okay at video games, this is my first time playing Dante's Inferno, and so it did take me quite a few chances, and I wasn't really I didn't have too much faith in my editing skills to be able to hop back and forth between me actually beating something, going back, dying, going back, and having to just kind of clip it all together. So I'm happy I got a continuous shot, which is really nice. But anyway, yeah, so we're starting off basically where we're about to kill the Grim Reaper, because yeah, I figured the beginning portion wasn't really needed for this particular project. But anyway, getting back to what I was talking about earlier with games influencing religion, religion influencing games, we know that Dante's Inferno is based or is influenced basically by the outside religions simply by looking at the character itself. Even if you have a very small working knowledge of Catholicism and Christianity, you would recognize that the cross sewn into the skin on Dante's chest is a symbol of his devotion to God, or really just that it's a symbol of Christianity. The lore of the game basically kind of goes into this idea that it wasn't necessarily him who necessarily believed in God, although he does obviously believe in death and obviously the Grim Reaper, and he does believe in God and Satan and all these other things. But it wasn't necessarily him who had the like intense devotion. It was actually his beloved Beatrice, who we will obviously meet later on in the gameplay, or well, meet. But anyway, not going to spoil anything. But basically, it's his like grand devotion to her, and she is the one that is incredibly devoted to like Catholicism and I mean God, but like as we'll see later on, she does make a deal with the devil. So I feel like although she does believe in God, it's obviously not as strong of a devotion as Dante believes it is, seeing as he has sewn this cross into his chest for her. Um, anyway, again, moving forward, the fact that Dante's Inferno is actually influenced by Catholicism actually feeds into my next point, which is that Dante's Inferno is an agent game. Meaning it holds strict rules and limitations on its gameplay, and it is an incredibly story-driven game with quests that really only lead to the end goal. This connects back into the subject of Catholicism because I would argue that although not all Catholics practice the same way, and I'm not necessarily trying to overgeneralize, Catholicism is an agent religion. Most hold very strict rules and limitations on what followers can do, and there is only really one end goal: heaven. And if you try and take any different path, you're really only going to end up somewhere you don't really want to be, which in this case and in Catholicism's case is hell. This isn't to say that this way of life is bad or negative. This is only to point out the difference between a stricter form of religion and something more similar to mysticism, where there could be 200 different avenues and 100 different places you could go on them. And it's just kind of up to you. It's like a choose your own adventure game. Whereas in more agent religions, more agent games, it is a choose your own adventure, but it's a choose your own adventure to one singular goal and not 200 different goals. This next part of the video is going to feature the question why. Why are women sexualized in video games? For starters, when asked, male gamer Zach Laguna, I'm going to pronounce that wrong, and I'm very sorry, believes that the reason women are over-sexualized is because males are the target audience for games, and thus they need something to catch the men's eyes as they're shopping for video games. For this to work, they would need to base their reasons on the assumption that men are the only ones playing the video games. And although the majority are, there is only a 4% discrepancy between the amount of men and the amount of women who are gamers. So if the case were that men were the majority of gamers and the far majority, not just by 4%, thus need to be catered to in a way, in the way of like big boobs and scant clothing when it comes to video game characters, then why are male characters not done in the same way to attract female gamers? My theory is that video games are seen by most as being a quote-unquote male thing, meaning that video game developers and system creators cater their games and systems to the group that they want playing their video games, not the groups that actually are, in practice, playing their games. They are basically saying, here you go, boys, we made this specially for you. Oh, now girls want to play too? Well, you're just going to have to suck it up and deal with playing a man who can't keep it in his pants. So basically saying like women just have to deal with the fact that they're just going to have to play men and they're just going to have to do all these like dangerous and risky and action moves, which is totally fine. But on the other hand, they're also going to have to stare at all these half naked women all over their screens. And that's just how it's going to have to be. In regards to the sexualization of women, is the premise that the reason we make women so sexualized in games like Dante's Inferno is that they need to establish a relationship between the male protagonist and the wife quickly without showing any actual context of their relationship. So basically, if you see a half-naked dead woman who looks very attractive in a video game just lying around and the protagonist shows even an ounce of care for them, you know that it was obviously their wife, girlfriend, lover, friend, whatever. And this is how a game and this is basically now going to set the course for the rest of the game, which is that you now have to avenge this like great love story or just avenge this woman who is obviously your wife because she's so sexy, and obviously sexy equals wife in this particular theory. Despite the fact that women are highly sexualized within video games, I would like to point out that in my time researching this topic, I didn't actually, I haven't actually been able to find conclusive evidence of video games leading to lack of empathy towards women outside of a virtual world. This means that I'm not at all arguing that having sexy women in video games leads to an increase in violent behaviors towards women in real life. In fact, a study conducted by Christopher Ferguson and Don Ellen found that violence towards women in video games actually increased empathy towards women shown by men. So there's still hope that although video games show women scantily clad and may affect how men think about women, it does not influence the ways in which they interact with them on a larger scale. At least not anything that leads to large spikes in data polls. Obviously, individual circumstances are individual circumstances, and we've heard about many where men have been influenced by video games to treat women in not so great ways. But this is just saying that on a general scale and like in the grand scheme of like a full male population, although obviously they're really only talking about people who play video games, the majority aren't treating women differently outside of video games, even though some might not necessarily treat women nicely in video games. Anyway, to finish off this video, I was hoping to talk a little bit about the male perspective. From Dante's point of view, he's just seen the love of his life die in front of him. Well, not die in front of him. I guess she was already dead. And instead of having a moment to grieve the loss of a person obviously incredibly dear to him, he instead sets off on this epic adventure filled with rendezvous and demon slaying. And this is basically telling men that they don't have the right to mourn or have feelings. It's comedian Patton Oswalt demonstrates during a set. Video games condition men to believe they aren't allowed to grieve, that after the loss of a loved one, you were just expected to brush it off and go about saving the world, when in reality, it is hardly a healthy way to deal with grief and loss. And it reinforces stereotypes on both men and women, that men need to be the strong, kick-ass authoritarian who makes the rules and sometimes breaks them, and that women need to be the pliant and soft, and that their very existence is dependent on the role and existence of their husbands, boyfriends, dads, brothers, etc. While researching how to connect this specific topic back into religious studies perspective, I would like to point out that, contrary to what I thought I would find while doing research regarding the parental role within Christian households as a way to connect this stereotype back into religion, I actually found that it was the complete opposite. John P. Bartkowski states in his article that although gender norms and identities within Protestant families are exaggerated in order to ensure children grow up knowing the quote-unquote proper ways to perform their gender, which as a side note is kind of an erasure of the LGBTQ community, but unfortunately I couldn't really go into that too much during this particular project, but it is an incredibly important part of sexuality, religion, and video games. But I digress. Faith actually forces fathers to be more involved fully in their children's lives. Basically, religion increases the parental role within the household. This was the opposite of what I was hoping to find, but actually presents a separate issue. If men within living within Christian communities hold strong parental values because that is how they were taught through their church and religious pamphlets, then how are non-religious men being taught how to be fathers, and how fathers are quote unquote supposed to act? This brings me back to the point above. Similar to Oswald, it would not surprise me to find out that most non denominational men are learning how to be dads or just men in general off of things that they see on social media, gaming, and through their own experiences growing up. So, if men are learning how to be quote unquote real men and dads from video games and online, then there could be an entirely different issue here. When the only representation of strong male morals is a testosterone-filled man who had a tantrum when he realized he couldn't show his girlfriend how impressive he was because she decided to shack up with the devil, obviously the only course of action would be for the men to mimic the stereotype of inflating his masculinity and burying his feelings. Now, though this connects back to nothing really besides the fact that burying your feelings is incredibly unhealthy, it is no surprise to learn that as a result of this hypermasculinity and this lack of ability to mourn, grieve, just in general feel anything, that almost 2/3 of deaths by suicide are men. Because around every corner and on every screen, we are basically saying that their emotions are worth nothing in comparison to their brawn, and so they just need to shut up about it and not talk about it, which is incredibly toxic for both men and for women. Because if you're not willing to talk about your feelings, then you're just going to either A, become incredibly sad, which leads back into the statistic, or B, you're going to become incredibly angry, which makes equal as much sense. And angry people have a tendency to lash out, which would also explain the higher domestic violence percentages towards women by men than from women to men. That kind of made sense. Anyway, to close up this video on a slightly happier note, of sorts, here are some things that I think should be implemented in order to make video games more fun and enjoyable for all. Cover dem titties. Was her breast showing really necessary for that particular part of the game? Have female stock characters be an option. Let us play us. Heck, even add in a few non-binary characters while you're at it. Why not? It'll make more fun for all. Add a grieving period. Although I totally understand a man going to a bar and getting sloshed or crying over a photo of his dead wife doesn't necessarily make for fantastic gameplay, maybe add in a quote-unquote 1 year later scene when we see the protagonist was able to grieve and they are now going forth to kick some ass and take some names. Or better yet, have the couple be a cool fighting duo where you can switch between the two characters and fight crime or demons or whatever together. These types of games exist and they are actually kind of fun. Finally, some honorable mentions of aging games are Gods of War, some Assassin's Creed games, and The Wolf Among Us. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will hopefully see you the next episode. Bye!